I've been thinking lately. This new 14-inch MacBook Pro that we're expecting to get in hopefully around 2 months, what if it's too good? Let me explain. So what got me thinking about this new 14-inch MacBook Pro again was a tweet by Twitter user Dylan. Now, Dylan and I have had a number of conversations. He's put out some pretty credible info, and I definitely trust him. So it was interesting when he tweeted, "It's comforting to note that both MacBook Pros that are coming this fall will have the same chip and the same performance. It's definitely a win for those who like to opt for the smaller size, but expect a notable increase in price for the 14-inch over the 13-inch. Now, this is a very interesting tweet. For the last couple of months, I have sort of assumed that the 14-inch and the 16-inch would share the same or very similar underlying chip, but that the 14-inch would be clocked down a little bit, sort of like the difference between the M1 MacBook Air and MacBook Pro, right? The Air is a little bit less powerful because it's a fanless design, it has one less GPU core, it doesn't sustain boosts as long as the Pro, and there's a number of minor differences like that. But what Dylan is implying here is that this new 14-inch could be much more identical to the 16-inch, and that basically the only difference between the two would be screen size. Now, that is not something that Apple has done before. So the first 13-inch MacBook Pro came out in 2009, and it initially was basically a branding clarification because in 2008, when the 15-inch MacBook Pro got the unibody new design language, the 13-inch MacBook came out in an aluminum model. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're going to think that looks exactly like the 13-inch MacBook Pro, and it does, but they called it the MacBook, and it was made of aluminum, and then the next year they were like, well, this is stupid, why not just call this a MacBook Pro that's a different size? And that's what they ran with. So ever since then, there has been a 13 and 15-inch MacBook Pro, and the differences between them have been pretty substantial. In fact, some might even argue that the 13-inch MacBook Pro hasn't been especially pro until very recently. And the major difference between the 13 and 15-inch MacBook Pros historically has been fewer cores and integrated graphics. There's a pretty substantial difference, but what we're talking about here is a 14 and 16-inch MacBook Pro where the only real difference is the size of the device. That's not something that Apple has really done before, and I think it would be a game changer. However, if you look at this 14-inch MacBook Pro and consider that internally it could be identical in terms of its configuration tree to the 16-inch MacBook Pro, but at a lower cost, it makes you wonder, why would you go for the 16-inch if the only reason that you're going to buy it is for the larger screen size? And why would you go for the M1 MacBook Pro if, like the rest of the Apple Silicon products, the new 14-inch comes in as a direct replacement to the existing 4-port Intel MacBook Pro at $1,799? So there's two parts to this dilemma. Number one is, why would you spend more on a 16-inch? And number two is, why wouldn't you spend more on the 14-inch coming up from the M1 MacBook Pro? I don't know if that difference makes sense to you or if I'm explaining that well, but we'll start with the first one. Why would you spend more on the 16-inch MacBook Pro? You might think, oh, well, people will just pay for a larger display. Well, there's reason to suggest that maybe they wouldn't. Do you remember the 17-inch MacBook Pro? That was discontinued 10 years ago, but in its final iteration, which came out in 2011, it was internally identical to the 15-inch MacBook Pro. It had the same exact specs, but it was a larger screen and a larger footprint and was therefore more expensive, and clearly demand wasn't that great for it because Apple decided not to make a Retina version of the 17-inch MacBook Pro, and they just went ahead and killed it. So you could make the argument that if you're gonna get the same performance, why would you spend, let's say, $300 extra, spec for spec, to bump up to the 16-inch size? Now, in terms of the other side of that argument of why wouldn't you buy the 14-inch, we have to take a look at the way the M1 MacBook Pro is structured price-wise right now. Because at $1299 and $1499, you can get it with the M1, obviously, and then 8 gigabytes of RAM for both of those. The only difference between the $1299 and $1499 is going from 256 to 512 gigabytes of storage. Now, if the past is to be believed in terms of setting a precedent for the new 14-inch MacBook Pro, I think we can expect it to come with 16 gigabytes of RAM and 512 gigabytes of storage. That's exactly what the current Intel 4-port MacBook Pro comes with at $1799. And so if Apple were to do that here, think about that for a second, right? You're getting the M1X, which is 10 cores, 8 performance. At that price point at $1799 or maybe $1899, you'd probably get the 16-core GPU, 16 gigs of RAM, and 512 gigabytes of storage with the new design, more ports, and hopefully it seems like a mini LED display at $1799 compared to $1499 for the M1 MacBook Pro, which is a 13-inch with the slower processor, the older design. Why would you buy that? Why would you not step up to this new 14-inch MacBook Pro unless you're buying a base model $1299 or like a refurbished or discounted M1 MacBook Pro? As soon as you start to spend anything more than $1,500, you should just completely ignore that and go for the 14-inch, hypothetically. So it kind of makes you wonder, would that be a little bit too good? Now, before I justify why I think the configurations will be as I just posed, because I know a lot of people are writing comments right now to disagree with me, delete that comment and write this comment instead. Do you think a 14-inch MacBook Pro, as I have described it, $1799, M1X, 16-core GPU, 16 gigs of RAM, 512 gigabytes of storage, would be the ultimate MacBook? I'm curious to know what you guys think. Now, let me justify why I think that configuration is the case, because I know there's going to be a lot of people that are going to say, oh, this is Apple. They're not going to give you all of that. They're going to give it 8 gigabytes of RAM. It's going to have 256 gigabytes of storage, and it's going to be $2,000. And that very well may be the case. However, I have very strong reason to suspect that Apple wants to keep board variations to a minimum. In the old Intel days, you could configure like a billion different combinations of specs. Look at the 16-inch right now. You've got 3 processor choices, there's like 5 graphics options, 4 RAM options, and like 8 storage tiers, right? And you can mix and match all of those. That's a lot of permutations, essentially, for Apple to have to manufacture. And so, when you look at the M1 MacBook Pro in contrast, there are comparatively very few options. The only thing that you can change in an M1 MacBook Pro, or even an M1 iMac, a Mac Mini, what have you, is the amount of RAM, 8 or 16, and then the amount of storage, 256 to 2 terabytes. Now, the reason that Apple is doing that is to simplify production. It's cheaper to manufacture more amounts of fewer types of board rather than having to manufacture a board that has like the base CPU but the higher graphics, and like you got to kind of manufacture all of these different board revisions. So when it comes to the M1X Max, I think Apple is going to do something very similar. I think there are 4 major versions. Think about it like a grid. You've got either 16 or 32 gigabytes of RAM, and you've got either 16 or 32 graphics cores. That means you can have 16 gigabytes and 16 cores, 16 gigabytes and 32 cores, 32 gigabytes and 16 cores, and 32 gigabytes and 32 cores. So that's 4 main variations of the actual SoC itself, and then of course there are other revisions for storage, but crucially, the storage isn't built onto the SoC itself. To corroborate this, I had an exclusive leak last month on Apple Track where I said that the new 14 and 16-inch MacBook Pros would have either 16 or 32 gigabytes of RAM, and that the 16-inch would not, as it currently does, have the option for 64 gigabytes. This is why. This is why that's the case. People were confused. They were like, why would Apple decrease the maximum amount of RAM? And it's because when you're manufacturing an SoC with unified memory architecture, if, like I just proposed, there are only 4 versions of it, it is much easier to manufacture logic boards for those devices. So I'm curious to know what you guys think of this. Do you think that's likely? I know I'm gonna get a ton of comments where people are gonna say, yeah, just expand the grid a little bit and have 8 and 64 gigabytes of RAM, so then there would be, I guess, 8 different options. I don't know. I think 16 and 32 is where it's going to be at. And as such, I think this new 14-inch is going to be such a good deal that unless you're buying the base model M1 MacBook Pro, it's just not worth spending money on, $200 to go to 16 gigabytes of RAM, $200 to go to 512 gigabytes of storage. At that point, you're only going to be like $100 away from a 14-inch with all of the great stuff that we're expecting. So it is definitely a little bit of a dilemma for the M1 MacBook Pro, which is already in a dilemma because of the MacBook Air. Like, already the recommendation is buy a MacBook Air instead of the Pro. And so if you've got the MacBook Air on the bottom side and then the 14-inch above it, the M1 MacBook Pro is weird. It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. In fact, I have a video where I discussed my theory about the M1 MacBook Pro that you should definitely go ahead and check out. I've got a card, I've linked it in the description below. Let me know what you think about that video and how this affects my findings there. But I'm really curious to see what this new 14-inch MacBook Pro ends up being. If it is in fact $1799, I think it will be the best Mac probably ever made. The biggest thing that I've seen is people are like, okay, well, it's going to be really good, but Apple's not going to sell it for $1799. They're going to sell it for $1999. I'm not sure about that one. I think that would be a bit of a jump. Like, just in terms of, if you're an average consumer and you're looking at Apple's pricing, right now you've got $999, $1299, $1499, $1799, $1999, $23. It sort of is a very logical progression. But if you go $999, $1299, $1499, $1999, that $500 gap in there, it's a little weird to me. Maybe, just maybe, Apple could consider increasing it from $1799 to $1899. Maybe that would make sense, but I don't think the 14-inch is going to be $2,000 to start. But only time will tell. I mean, it's not like Apple hasn't had weird pricing overlap in the past. Like the 4 Thunderbolt port Intel MacBook Pro is a prime example of that. If you spec'd that up with 32 gigabytes of RAM and a terabyte of storage, it got really expensive to the point where you would just want to buy a 16-inch MacBook Pro instead. So I don't think it rules out having a $1799 14-inch MacBook Pro just because it's going to be a little bit close in terms of pricing with the performance and pricing overlap that you would get with the M1 and the 16-inch MacBook Pro. So I'm really curious to hear what you guys think about all of this. Do you think the 14-inch MacBook Pro is going to be too good, or do you think that Apple is just figuring out another way to screw us out of money and put the Apple tax in it? Let me know in the comments below. As usual, don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LukeMiani, and definitely make sure to be subscribed because I've got more fun stuff coming soon. What do you think of this angle in the studio? I think it looks really good. Anyway, that's it for today's video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.